Under the sinking Arizona sun, the trading post yard breathed with dust, tobacco, and the bitter tang of spilled whiskey, a place where men gathered not for commerce, but for spectacle. Rough boots pressed into the ground, forming a circle around a trembling figure who was shoved forward by a drunken hand. She stumbled, her wrists bound by coarse rope, her dress torn and slipping, her skin bruised by fists and neglect. A murmur rippled through the crowd, mocking, spitting, dismissive. $2, the ranch hand barked, his laughter sharp. That's all she's worth. And with every word she lowered her gaze, not from shame, but from the instinct of survival. Eyes burned into her, yet no hand reached to lift her. For them, she was not a person, only a bargain, a shadow priced for labor or worse. But amidst the jeers and the cruel laughter, one figure did not turn away. A man stood at the yard's edge, broad-shouldered beneath a dust-stained hat, his scar catching the dying light. Ethan Cole. A cowboy who had learned the silence of survival, a man whose heart carried scars as deep as the land itself. He had not come seeking company nor salvation, but there he stood, unable to walk away. The weight of war still echoed in his bones, and in the sight of her trembling hands he felt the stir of something both heavy and healing. He stepped forward, steady as stone. The crowd hushed. The ranch hand sneered, yet opened his palm, greedy for coin. 2 silver dollars clinked into the dirt-stained skin of his hand, a sum meant for nails and lamp oil, but now traded for dignity. Ethan's knife flashed, not in threat, but in freedom. The rope fell, welts exposed, and the young woman gasped, half in disbelief, half in fear, that this, too, was another trap. But his hand returned the blade to its sheath, and his silence held no command, only a quiet promise that spoke louder than any oath. She did not trust him, not yet. Her body swayed, bruised and worn, her thoughts circling like startled birds. Yet when his hand touched her elbow, steady but not forceful, she let herself be guided away from the circle of leering eyes. The crowd dispersed, their entertainment ended, their cruelty forgotten as quickly as it was played. But for her, every step away from that yard was a step into the unknown. She did not yet know his name, nor the shape of his heart. But something fragile shifted, fear bending toward the first thread of hope. The mule carried her north as shadows stretched across the desert. Ethan walked beside her in silence, each step a rhythm of quiet strength. She wanted to ask where he was taking her, why he had paid what others would not. But her voice was trapped behind raw fear. So instead she watched the set of his shoulders, broad and unyielding, and told herself to keep breathing. For the first time in too long, she was not waiting for the strike of a hand. The cabin rose out of the ridge like a secret kept from the world, plain, weathered, yet standing firm. He lifted her down with a gentleness that startled her, his hands leaving no claim, only space. Inside, the scent of wood smoke and coffee lingered. A bar of soap, a folded cotton shirt, a basin of warm water. These were not gifts, only the plainest of offerings, yet to her they felt like something rare, almost holy. For so long she had been stripped of privacy, stripped of choice, but here was a man who turned his back as she washed, who spoke in a voice steady and low. "I'll stay put." No demands, no mocking laughter, only stillness. As night fell, the fire burned low, shadows flickering against rough-hewn logs. She lay wrapped in his spare blanket, her body trembling not from fear of his nearness, but from the unfamiliar sensation of safety. Fragile, but real. He sat by the stove, his hat tipped low, keeping silent watch. And in that silence, something healing began. Not yet trust, not yet love, but the soil in which both might grow. Morning brought pale light through the shutters, painting stripes across the floor. She stirred to the sound of coffee brewing, to the scent of bread, to a man who did not hover, but simply lived beside her. Her chest tightened with confusion. Every man she had known had wanted something. Yet this one spoke with plain words, his gaze never claiming, and when she dared to whisper, rough with disuse, "Why did you pay?" his answer came without flourish. "Because leaving you there would have been wrong. $2 didn't matter. You did." She carried that truth with her, heavy yet warm, as she folded the shirt around herself and tried to mend the frayed edges of her heart. Perhaps she was still afraid, still uncertain of what tomorrow held. But in the steady rhythm of his presence, she began to feel the faintest possibility of belonging. And so their story, born in dust and cruelty, began its slow, quiet turn toward healing. A tale that would carry through storms, through whispers of doubt, through the steady beat of two scarred hearts daring to find warmth in each other. As the sun rose higher over the desert, the first fragile threads of love had already been spun, though neither of them yet dared to name it. If this story touches something within you, if it stirs a spark of hope or eases a shadow in your own heart, I invite you to walk with it further. Your voice matters here. Leave a comment, share your thoughts. Let this healing journey ripple wider. And if you feel the warmth of this tale and wish to see it grow, I welcome you to like, to subscribe, to stay close as we breathe life into the chapters yet to come. Because stories, like hearts, grow stronger when shared. And beyond that night, beyond the hush of firelight and the trembling of a soul learning safety again, the journey was only beginning. The desert would test them. The world would question them. But together, one scarred cowboy, one wounded woman, they would discover what it meant to build not just shelter, but a home. The desert stretched wide and endless, its silence broken only by the steady rhythm of hooves against the dry earth and the soft rattle of saddle leather. The mule carried her weight with patience, every step a slow climb away from the trading yard that had nearly swallowed her spirit. Ethan walked beside her, his stride firm, his limp only a faint reminder of old wounds that time had never fully healed. He did not speak, and she did not ask. Yet the silence between them was not harsh. It was a space that seemed to breathe, a fragile pause where pain could loosen its grip. She sat high in the saddle, her hands sore from rope burns, her body bruised in too many places to count. Still, she clutched the saddle horn and told herself to stay upright. She did not know where he was leading her, nor why he had chosen her when no one else had. Suspicion lingered in her chest, whispering that men always wanted something, that kindness was another mask for control. But every glance at his shoulders, broad, steady, guiding without force, planted the faintest seed of doubt in her fears. Could this silence mean something different? Could this journey hold something other than another cage? The road wound north, weaving between cottonwoods that bent under the weight of the evening breeze. Dust glowed pale in the dying light, settling on her lashes, clinging to his coat. The air cooled as the sun slipped behind the ridges, and for the first time in months she felt the sharpness of night air as something clean, not suffocating. Her lungs drew it in like a balm, each breath easing the ache in her ribs. She closed her eyes briefly, letting that healing chill remind her that she was still alive, still moving forward. When the cabin finally came into sight, she felt her chest tighten. It was small, only one room, built of pine logs, its roof patched with shingles that bore the scars of weather. A wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, curling into the twilight sky, and a faint glow spilled through the cracks of shuttered windows. It was not much, but to her eyes, dulled by cruelty and fear, it looked like a fortress. Ethan untied the mule's reins, lifted her down gently, his hands careful not to press against her bruises. The moment his touch left her, she stepped back instinctively, watching him with wary eyes. He gave her space without protest, moving to open the cabin door, his voice low but even. Inside. The threshold was more daunting than the trading yard had been. She lingered, scanning the small yard, the corral where 2 lean cows stood, the tilled ground now overrun with weeds. Every instinct told her to mistrust, to question whether this was just another prison. But the thought of turning back, to dust, to jeers, to ropes, was unbearable. With a quiet breath, she stepped across the threshold. The room was plain, carrying the scent of wood smoke and stale coffee. A single bed rested against the wall, a folded blanket waiting at its edge. A table stood near the stove, its surface scarred with years of use. 2 chairs pulled close. His rifle leaned in the corner, boots lined neatly beside the wall. She scanned it all quickly, her body tense, waiting for the command, for the claim she had always been forced to endure. But none came. Instead, Ethan set a bar of soap and a folded cotton shirt on the bed. He did not look at her as he stoked the fire, poured water into a basin, and placed it within reach. "You can wash," he said, his voice steady, and then sat in the chair with his hat pulled low, his back turned. Her throat tightened. She picked up the soap with trembling fingers, staring at it as though it were a trick. Yet when she dipped the cloth in warm water and touched it to her skin, she felt something shift. Dirt, blood and dust lifted from her body, sliding away like a layer of shame she had carried too long. The sting of heat on her cuts was sharp, but beneath it was a soothing warmth, like the first touch of healing after pain. She slipped into the shirt, coarse cotton but clean, falling loosely over her bruised frame. For the first time in months, she did not feel watched, did not feel claimed. She folded her torn dress into a bundle and sat quietly on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap. Ethan did not turn. His silence was deliberate, not careless. He seemed to understand that questions would be too heavy, that demands would break what little thread of trust had been formed. Instead, he let the fire speak for him, its crackle filling the space between them. At last, her voice, raw and unused, broke the quiet. "My name, Sa." He lifted his head slightly, repeating it once. "Sa." The way he spoke it held no claim, no ownership, just acknowledgement. A small nod, then his gaze returned to the fire. Something eased inside her, a knot uncoiling just enough for her chest to rise without ache. For years her name had been taken from her lips, reduced to a sound of obedience or scorn. But here, in this plain cabin, it was returned to her as if it were whole again. That night she lay under the blanket, listening to the steady sigh of the fire, her body tense at first, waiting for the sound of boots crossing the floor, for hands reaching where she did not want them. But none came. Instead, she heard the creak of the chair as Ethan shifted, the faint rhythm of his breath as he kept watch. Slowly, her muscles loosened. Her heart, though fragile, began to steady. And in that stillness, she felt the first fragile whisper of safety curl around her like the blanket itself. Morning broke pale and cold, light slipping through the shutters in soft stripes. She woke startled, her chest tight, until she saw the cabin walls, the folded shirt still covering her body, and Ethan at the stove, pouring coffee into a tin cup. He glanced at her briefly, not speaking, not pressing, and set bread on the table. The quiet was not suffocating any more. It was almost calming, like a river after a storm. She sat slowly, her hands trembling as she broke the bread. Her eyes lifted once, meeting his. "Why did you pay?" Her voice cracked with the question, a mixture of fear and desperate need for truth. He did not look away. His words came plain, steady. "Because leaving you there would have been wrong. $2 didn't matter. You did." The weight of that answer sank deep into her chest. Not a grand speech, not a false promise, only truth laid bare. And in that moment, she realized something she had not dared to believe for so long. Perhaps she was not just a burden to be bought or sold. Perhaps she was someone worth saving. The fire popped softly, sending sparks up the stovepipe. She breathed in the warmth, clutching her bread, her thoughts turning slowly like the embers themselves. Outside, the desert stretched endless, yet for the first time she felt the stirrings of a path not carved in pain. Here, in this cabin with a scarred cowboy and his quiet strength, something new had begun. It was not yet love, not yet trust, but it was healing. And as the day grew brighter, the thread that tied her to despair loosened just enough to let the possibility of belonging take root. And so, with coffee steaming between them and silence steady as stone, their lives shifted into a fragile rhythm. Two souls scarred by loss, yet moving closer with each breath, each glance, toward a bond neither had sought, but both would come to need. The journey of hearts, scarred yet searching, had only just begun, carrying them toward trials that would test them, and moments that would soften them, step by step into the fragile promise of something greater. The days unfolded with a slow rhythm, quiet as the desert wind, each moment weaving a fragile thread between two lives that had once known only solitude and pain. Sa woke to the smell of wood smoke and coffee, the rough crackle of firewood catching beneath Ethan's careful hands. The cabin was plain, its walls carrying the weight of silence, but little by little that silence began to shift. It no longer pressed heavy on her chest. It settled like a blanket, wrapping her in something she had nearly forgotten, a sense of safety. She moved cautiously at first, unsure of what was expected. Each gesture was tested, each step measured, but Ethan never demanded, never ordered. He split wood in the yard, his axe rising and falling with steady force, while she folded the coarse cotton shirt he had given her, brushing her fingers across its fabric, as if trying to memorize its honesty. She scrubbed the basin after washing, tidied the table, and tended to the small fire in the stove. These were simple things, yet each task gave her back a piece of herself that had been stripped away. It was healing work, work that reminded her she still had the power to choose. One evening, when shadows stretched long across the cabin walls, Ethan returned from the corral with his trail coat in hand. The lining had torn, rough edges hanging loose from years of use. Without asking, Sa fetched needle and thread from the small shelf. Her fingers, though raw and calloused, stitched with the practiced care of someone who had mended more than cloth in her life. Ethan paused in the doorway, watching her. He said nothing, but the faint easing in his chest was undeniable. She had chosen to act, not out of fear, but out of her own will. That choice filled the room with a warmth no fire could give. When the coat was repaired, she folded it neatly and set it by his chair. For a long moment she sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap. The firelight painted soft glow across her face, highlighting the healing bruises, the scars of recent torment. She caught him watching her, his scar outlined in the same golden light, his jaw steady, but his eyes carrying the same tired weight she carried. She hesitated, her voice trembling as though afraid of its own sound. "My name is Sa." Ethan repeated it, firm and even, his tone neither questioning nor claiming. "Sa." Then he gave a single nod, returning to the slow stroke of his knife against the whetstone. For the first time, her name had been spoken without mockery, without cruelty. It was not stolen, not twisted. It was given back, whole and steady. That night she lay beneath the blanket, clutching it close, and whispered her name once more into the dark, as if reminding herself that she still existed. The days after fell into a rhythm. Ethan worked outside, mending fences, hauling water, tending to the small herd. Sa moved inside, mending cloth, sweeping dust from the corners, humming soft tunes from her people when she thought he was too far to hear. He heard, though he never said so. Those songs, fragile and low, turned the cabin from a place of exile into a place of living. They were threads of memory, threads of pain, but also threads of hope. He listened, and the sound made the hollow spaces of the cabin feel less empty. One morning, Ethan saddled the mule and prepared for a trip to town. Supplies were nearly gone, flour, coffee, salt, all scraped to their ends. He told her plainly, "We ride tomorrow." His words were not commands, only the steady statement of necessity. Sa's chest tightened at the thought of the trading yard, the cruel eyes that had once looked on her as nothing. Yet when she nodded, it was not obedience. It was choice, born of the knowledge that survival meant moving forward. The ride into town was long, the trail winding through cottonwoods and dry washes. Sa sat tall in the saddle, a plain shawl draped around her shoulders, her hands gripping the horn with steady resolve. Her heart hammered as rooftops came into view, smoke curling from chimneys, voices carrying across the dusty street. Whispers began the moment they tied their animals to the hitch rail. Eyes turned, lips curled, judgments whispered loud enough to sting. Sa felt their gaze like stones pressing against her skin. She wanted to vanish, but Ethan's hand reached out, steady, offering hers down from the mule. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. Inside the store, the air was heavy with flour dust and leather. The shopkeeper froze for a moment, his gaze caught on Sa's face before Ethan's voice cut through. "Flour, coffee, salt, cloth too, Blue, if you have it." The words were plain, the tone steady, leaving no room for argument. Sa stood beside him, her hands clasped, her eyes scanning shelves she had not seen in months. When he added, "Boots, women's size 6, her breath caught. He had noticed, without asking, the size of her steps. The knowledge startled her, but it also softened something inside. To be seen not as a thing, but as a person whose needs were quietly measured, was a gift she could not ignore. The door creaked open, and the ranch hand from the yard stumbled in, his breath already sour with whiskey. His eyes narrowed, his sneer familiar and sharp. "Thought I got rid of that problem," he muttered. Sa froze, her throat tightening, memory dragging her back to rope and dust. Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between them, his voice low and even. "You took your money. That was the end of it. Leave it there." The ranch hand spat, his words dripping venom. "She'll bring you nothing but trouble." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "Then it'll be my trouble." The certainty in his tone left no room for debate. Sa's hands trembled in the folds of her shawl, but for the first time she believed she would not have to face those jeers alone again. Outside, after the goods were packed onto the mule, Ethan leaned close, his voice meant for her alone. "You're safe with me. They can look, but they can't take you." She swallowed hard, her chest trembling with the weight of his words. Fear lingered, but it was steadied by something stronger. The belief that perhaps she had found someone who would stand firm beside her. When they returned to the cabin, the bolt of blue cloth rested on the table. Sa traced her fingers along its edge, feeling the softness of new fabric, the possibility of new beginnings. That night, as the fire glowed low and the desert wind whispered through the cracks, she realized that something had shifted. The cabin was no longer just Ethan's. It was slowly becoming hers too. The days that followed grew into a rhythm of shared work. She cut the cloth into pieces, sewing carefully until a dress began to take shape. Ethan split wood and mended harness leather while she hummed softly, her hands stitching threads with the same patience that had begun stitching their lives together. Each quiet act became a form of healing. Each moment of silence grew warmer, less heavy, as though the air itself learned to carry peace. And though questions lingered, where her family had gone, what ghosts haunted him, whether the world would leave them be, the cabin walls now held more than solitude. They held two lives slowly learning to lean toward one another, scar by scar, choice by choice. And within the stillness of the desert, the fragile promise of love continued to grow, unseen yet undeniable, carrying them toward storms and tenderness alike. The desert storm rose without warning, clouds rolling heavy across the horizon, carrying with them a wall of rain that swept down like an army of shadows. Ethan had seen the signs early, the shift in the wind, the sharp tang of moisture in the air, the restless lowing of cattle in the corral. By the time the first drops hit the cabin roof, he had already dragged out canvas, nails, and hammer. Sa followed him into the yard, her shawl clinging wet to her shoulders, her hair plastered against her cheeks. Lightning cracked against the ridges, thunder shaking the ground beneath their feet. Ethan worked with calm determination, his body moving despite the limp that slowed him. He handed her the hammer without hesitation, his voice steady, even as rain poured in sheets around them. "Hold this seam down," she obeyed, her fingers raw from gripping the soaked canvas, the wind tugging at her arms with violent force, but she did not falter. Each nail she drove into place echoed with something deeper than survival. It was the sound of two lives anchoring themselves against the storm together. When at last they stumbled back into the cabin, soaked and breathless, the fire roared high in the stove. Steam lifted from their clothes, the scent of wet earth filling the small room. Sa stripped the shawl from her shoulders and hung it over the chair, her chest rising fast, her skin flushed from the effort. Ethan set his hat by the door, water dripping from its brim, his hair dark against his scar. For a long moment they simply stood there, breath mingling with the heat of the fire, their eyes locking in a silence heavy with more than words. It was not the storm outside that bound them, it was the way they had faced it side by side. Her gaze softened, and she felt her chest ease for the first time since the night he had cut her free. She was not just a burden carried into his home. She was a hand he trusted with nails, a presence he welcomed into his struggle. And in that recognition, something inside her healed. They ate by the fire that night, the rain hammering steady on the roof, their mugs steaming with coffee. Ethan reached across the table and rested his rough hand lightly on hers. It was not a grasp, not a claim, only the gentle pressure of presence. Sa's breath caught, her instinct to flinch rising, but instead she turned her palms slowly, letting their fingers align. The warmth of his hand seeped into hers, stronger than the storm's chill, steady enough to anchor her racing heart. No one outside could see it. No crowd, no judge, no trader. But in that small cabin, the touch was a vow. When the rain finally eased, the fire dimmed, and the night grew still, Sa lay awake in the bed, the blanket pulled close around her. The storm had quieted, but her mind still stirred with memories, chains, jeers, the rope burning her wrists. She turned onto her side, staring into the dark. Her breath quickened, her body trembling as the fear clawed its way back. Ethan, though he said nothing, heard the shift. His chair creaked softly as he rose. He stopped at the edge of the bed, not moving closer until she reached out, her hand trembling as it found his. Her voice was a whisper, raw with need. "Stay." He sat slowly, his weight pressing into the mattress, his hand resting over hers. He did not draw her close, did not push. He simply stayed, a steady presence at her side. Her breathing steadied, her fingers clinging to his, as though he were the tether that kept her from drowning in memory. At last she whispered, her voice breaking, "I know you won't hurt me." It was not only belief, it was choice. She wanted it to be true, and in the way his hand stayed firm yet gentle, she felt it was. Ethan lowered his head, pressing his lips against her hair, a gesture light as breath, hesitant but unguarded. Sa tilted her face toward him, her cheek brushing against his jaw, and their lips met. The kiss was tentative, unpracticed, a meeting of two souls, too familiar with pain, yet aching for something softer. It was not possession, it was not payment. It was a choice freely made in the quiet of a night where healing had begun to take root. Ethan leaned back, leaving space, his arm draped loosely across her waist above the blanket. She turned toward him, placing her hand over his, holding it there as though she could anchor herself in that touch. Their breathing slowed, hearts finding rhythm together. And for the first time in months, Sa closed her eyes, not from exhaustion, but from peace. The dawn that followed carried a new stillness. She rose from the bed, with shoulders less heavy, her steps lighter on the wooden floor. As she tended to the fire, stirring beans in the pot, she found herself humming without realizing it. The melody was low, a song from her people, a song of loss, but also of survival. Ethan listened from his chair, sharpening his knife in silence. He did not interrupt, did not question. He only let the sound carry through the cabin, a song that healed something inside both of them. That afternoon, as sunlight broke through the clouds and warmed the earth outside, she carried laundry to the line. Ethan watched from the porch, his scarred face softened by the glow. Sa's dress, stitched from the bolt of blue cloth, swayed in the breeze. She looked up and caught his gaze, her lips curving in the faintest smile. It was not yet love spoken aloud, but it was the beginning of something deeper, an understanding that what tied them together was not rope, not trade, but choice. The desert had tested them, the storm had tried to break them, but together they had stood. And as the sun lowered behind the ridges, painting gold across the sky, they carried within their cabin not only the memory of survival, but the promise of healing love. Their bond, still fragile, was no longer silence alone. It was presence, trust, and the first tender stirrings of a home that could belong to them both. The night settled again, softer than the one before. Sa folded the repaired coat by his chair, her hands steady, her heart no longer trembling with every sound. Ethan rested by the fire, his rifle set aside, his scarf faint in the glow, and as they shared the quiet, no longer sharp but warm, they both knew the path had shifted. They had begun to move step by step towards something neither of them had dared hope for, a love born not of rescue, not of pity, but of healing, choice, and the courage to trust. The rhythm of their days deepened after the storm, the cabin no longer only a shelter, but a place where two lives began to knit together in small, deliberate ways. Sa awoke each morning to the glow of sunlight filtering through the shutters, to the smell of coffee brewing steady on the stove, and to the quiet scrape of Ethan's boots across the floor. She found her body no longer tensed in panic at the sound of his steps. Instead, she felt a quiet assurance that he would not harm her. That healing realization, fragile yet certain, became the ground on which she stood. Ethan noticed her changes in silence. He watched the way she folded the new blue dress she had stitched, smoothing the seams with careful hands. He noticed how she walked with her shoulders a little straighter, how her gaze no longer remained fixed to the floor. When he came inside one evening, he found her humming softly as she kneaded dough, her hands dusted with flour, her lips curved in the faintest trace of a smile. He didn't interrupt. He only leaned his weight against the doorframe, letting the sound fill the cabin like a balm. But the world beyond the cabin had not forgotten them. Supplies dwindled, and Ethan knew they would have to return to town. He told her in the same even voice he used for everything important. "We ride tomorrow. Flour, coffee, salt." She nodded, her breath tightening, memories of the trading yard pressing close. Yet when she adjusted the shawl around her shoulders the next morning and climbed onto the mule, it was not fear that guided her. It was resolve. She would not enter town as a broken captive, but as someone who chose to walk beside him. The town greeted them with whispers, the weight of eyes pressing from boardwalks and windows. Sa felt the burn of every stare, but Ethan's presence beside her steadied her heart. He dismounted first, held out his hand, and when she placed hers in his, she lifted her chin. If they were to see her, they would see her as a woman at his side, not as a body to be traded. Inside the general store, Ethan ordered what they needed with his usual plainness. Flour, coffee, salt, cloth. When he added, "Boots, women's size 6. Sa's breath caught. She had not told him her size, yet he had seen, measured, remembered. She looked at him with cautious surprise, the weight of his quiet observation settling in her chest like warmth. The door swung open, and the ranch hand stepped inside. His sneer carried the stink of whiskey, his words meant to wound. "Didn't figure you for the type to waste good coin," he spat. Sa froze, her body stiff with memory. Ethan moved without hurry, stepping between them, his voice low, controlled. "You took your money. That was the end of it. Leave it there." The ranch hand snarled, his eyes sliding toward Sa, but Ethan's stillness cut sharper than any blade. "She'll bring you nothing but trouble," the man growled. Ethan didn't flinch. "Then it'll be my trouble." The words settled heavy in the room, their certainty unshakable. The ranch hand spat and turned away, leaving only the echo of boots on the boardwalk behind him. Sa's hands trembled beneath her shawl, but when Ethan leaned close, his voice was steady, meant only for her. "You're safe with me. They can look, but they can't take you." She swallowed hard, nodding, the truth of it sinking deep into the wounded places of her heart. For the first time since the yard, she felt she was not alone in facing the world. They rode out of town with supplies packed tight, the eyes of the crowd fading behind them. Sa sat taller in the saddle than she had when they arrived, her grip less desperate, her breathing calmer. Ethan rode close beside her, his silence the kind that healed rather than weighed. The desert stretched wide, yet she no longer felt lost in its vastness. With every mile, the fear loosened its hold, and something steadier took root. Back at the cabin, Sa laid the bolt of blue cloth across the table, running her fingers over its smoothness. It was hers, not taken, not forced, but chosen. She cut it into pieces, her stitches patient and true, until a dress emerged that fit her body in a way the old torn fabric never could. When she wore it for the first time, her shoulders lifted, her eyes brightened. She burned the old dress in the fire pit behind the cabin, the smoke rising into the sky like the closing of a chapter. Ethan watched from the porch, saying nothing, but the faint ease in his expression told her he understood the weight of that act. Life settled into rhythm again, but with each day the bond between them deepened. She laid food on the table without being told, weeded the patch of earth behind the corral, mended his coat before he even asked. These were not tasks of obligation, but of choice, small declarations of belonging. Ethan felt the shift too. When he placed a blanket across her shoulders at night, she no longer stiffened. She adjusted it herself, her breath steadying into sleep with his watchful presence near. Yet the world was not finished testing them. One afternoon, 2 riders appeared on the ridge, dust trailing behind their horses. Ethan saw them first, his jaw tightening. One was the ranch hand, face bloated with drink. The other wore a tarnished deputy's badge. They rode into the yard, spitting accusations, claims of theft, of women kept against their will. The deputy's words cut cold. I need to hear her say she's here by choice. Sa's throat clenched, fear clawing through her chest. The memory of the rope, the jeers, the spit at her feet rose sharp and merciless. She wanted to stay silent, but Ethan's shoulders stood firm before her, broad and unyielding, shielding her from their gaze. She drew a breath, trembling but resolute. I stay because I choose. Her words, though shaking, carried more strength than she had known she still possessed. The deputy studied her eyes, searching for doubt. Finding none, he nodded and turned to the ranch hand. You took money. That was the end of it. If you've got a complaint, file it with the judge. The ranch hand cursed, but he knew better than to push further. With a bitter spit into the dirt, he turned his horse and rode away. The deputy tipped his hat, muttering only, "Look after each other," before following. When the dust settled, Sa realized she was still clutching her dress with trembling fists. Ethan turned, meeting her gaze with more words than he usually spent. No one takes you from here. Not while I'm standing. Her throat tightened, but not with fear. Something steadier, warmer filled her chest. She stepped close, resting her forehead against his chest, her breath shaking against him. He did not pull her tighter, did not crowd her. He simply stood, steady as stone, letting her lean until her strength returned. That night, by the fire, she watched him sharpen his knife, his scar pale in the glow. Her heart swelled with the knowledge of what had passed. The world had tried to claim her again, but she had spoken, and he had stood. Fear remained, but it had changed. It was no longer the fear of being dragged away in chains. It was the fear of losing what she had found. A home, a steady hand, a man whose silence was not emptiness, but strength. As the flames crackled, Sa realized she had chosen not only to stay, but to fight for the life they were building. The cabin was no longer just refuge. It was the ground of healing, of trust, of the fragile but growing love that tied them closer with each passing day. And in the quiet of that desert night, with firelight flickering against the logs, she knew their journey had turned toward something greater than survival. It had turned toward belonging. The weeks that followed carried a new weight, not heavy like chains, but steady like roots. Sa no longer moved through the cabin as a guest uncertain of her place. She walked as though the ground beneath her feet might finally hold her. The scar of fear still lived inside her, but it softened each day, replaced by something she had almost forgotten. Choice. Ethan felt the change too. He saw it in the way she reached for the broom without waiting for him to ask, in the way she pulled weeds behind the corral, her hands raw but determined, in the way she laid his mended coat across the chair by the fire as though it belonged there, waiting for him. As at night, she still woke with a start, her breath racing, the shadows of memory clawing at her throat. But when she turned toward the glow of the stove and heard the creak of his chair, she knew she was not alone. His voice would come, low and steady in the dark. "You're safe here." He never said more, never tried to soothe her with empty promises, but the weight of those 3 words, spoken plain, carried more healing than she had ever been given. Sometimes, when the fear pressed hardest, she whispered back, "I know." And with that, her breathing eased, her trembling stilled, and she drifted back into the fragile calm of sleep. One night, the storm of memory struck harder. She woke with a cry caught in her throat, her body damp with sweat, the fire burned to embers. Ethan rose from his chair, his steps measured as he crossed the room. He stopped at the edge of the bed, waiting, not looming, not pressing. She reached out, her hand trembling as it found his. Her voice was broken, but steady enough to hold one word. "Stay." He sat, his weight sinking the mattress, his hand resting at her waist above the blanket. He did not move closer, did not push beyond what she had given. His presence alone was enough, steady as stone. She held his hand tight, clutching it like a lifeline, and her breath began to steady. For a long time they sat in silence, their heartbeats slowing into rhythm together. She turned toward him, her forehead brushing his shoulder, the faint rasp of his shirt against her cheek. Ethan lowered his head slightly, pressing his lips to her hair, a kiss soft as breath. Sa tilted her face, brushing her cheek against his jaw, and their lips met. The kiss was hesitant, slow, the meeting of two lives too familiar with pain, yet daring to reach for something gentler. It was not born of demand, not born of debt, but of choice. When they parted, neither spoke. He lay beside her, leaving space, his arm resting lightly across her waist. She placed her hand over his, holding it there, and together they drifted into the first night that felt not like survival, but like belonging. The dawn that followed carried a new stillness. Sa moved with a lighter step, her eyes lifting more often, her breath unburdened. As she stirred beans on the stove, a melody escaped her lips, soft and low. It was a song from her people, one of sorrow and strength, of memory and endurance. Ethan paused at the doorway, listening. He said nothing, only let the sound fill the cabin, carrying a healing that reached deeper than words. He felt the hollow spaces inside him shift, filled with her voice, with the fragile beauty of what they were building together. That afternoon, as sunlight stretched across the ridge, Sa carried laundry to the line, her blue dress swaying in the breeze. Ethan watched from the porch, his scar pale in the light, his eyes steady on her. When she turned and caught his gaze, she did not lower her head. Instead, her lips curved into a faint smile, small but certain. It startled him, that smile, because it was the first he had seen since the day he cut her free. He gave her the faintest nod in return, a silent acknowledgement that something had changed. Their work became partnership. They mended fences side by side, carried water from the wash, cleared soil for planting. When the sun dipped low, they ate together, their silence no longer heavy but companionable. At night, when the wind rattled the shutters, she no longer trembled in fear, but leaned closer beneath the blanket, her hand finding his without hesitation. The healing between them did not erase the scars, but it softened them, wove them into something new. Each gesture, each wordless glance, carried the weight of trust being rebuilt piece by piece. Sa no longer asked herself if she would stay. She already knew. And Ethan, once a man who had vowed to live alone, found himself watching her across the table, realizing the cabin no longer felt like a solitary refuge, but like a home. The bond they had forged in silence, in storms, in the quiet rhythm of shared days, grew deeper, steadier. It was not a sudden flame, but a slow fire, burning constant, warming the spaces inside them that had once been frozen. And as the desert wind carried the scent of sage through the open window, both knew their story had turned another page. What had begun as rescue was becoming something greater. Love rooted in healing, in choice, in the quiet courage to trust again. The world outside might still test them, But within the walls of that cabin, a new life was unfolding, steady, fragile, but theirs. And in that knowledge, they stepped forward, scar by scar, toward a future they had not dared to imagine, but one they were now willing to build together. Spring settled softly across the desert, bringing with it green shoots from soil that had lain brown through the winter, and the cabin no longer felt like a lone outpost against the ridge. Smoke rose from the chimney each morning, the sound of axes and quiet humming weaving through the air, and there was a rhythm to life now that spoke of more than survival. Sa no longer drifted through her days, uncertain of her place. She walked with steady steps, her blue dress brushing against her boots, her hair tied back neatly as she tended to the garden she had carved behind the corral. Beans and squash pushed through the earth under her care, fragile yet insistent, much like her own heart learning to grow again. Ethan watched her one morning from the porch, the scar on his cheek catching the light. He realized that his cabin no longer carried the silence of loneliness. It carried her voice, her footsteps, her presence, and that changed everything. He had once thought solitude his only refuge, but now, as she knelt to tend the soil, he felt a new truth settling into his chest. He wanted this life not alone, but with her. The whispers in town had not vanished. Each trip for supplies brought stares, muttered words, sideways glances that burned sharper than the desert sun. Some saw her as nothing more than the woman bought for $2 silver, a reminder of cruelty they preferred to dismiss. Yet each time they walked side by side, Ethan's quiet strength shielded her, and Sa's steady gaze, no longer lowered to the ground, silenced more than one whisper. Healing was not found in the approval of others, but in the knowledge that she belonged where she chose, and she chose to stand beside him. But Ethan knew that whispers alone were not enough to silence those who might try to twist her story. One evening, as firelight flickered across the log walls, he spoke more words than usual, his voice quiet but certain. "We'll ride to the county seat. I want it written down, your choice, your name, so no one can take it from you." Sa looked at him long, her heart catching on the truth beneath his plain words. This was not for him. It was for her. And after a moment she nodded. The ride was long, dust rising behind their horses as they crossed the open desert. Sa rode with her shoulders straight, her shawl tied firm against the morning wind. The county seat was larger than the nearby town, its streets crowded with wagons, merchants calling over goods, children darting between horses. She felt the knot in her stomach tighten, but when she walked beside Ethan into the courthouse, she carried herself with a steadiness she had not possessed months ago. The clerk looked at them over his spectacles, suspicion lingering in his eyes. Ethan explained in a voice plain as ever that Sa lived with him by her own choice, and he wanted it written clear. The clerk dipped his pen, scratched words onto paper, and slid it across the desk. Ethan signed his name without pause. Sa hesitated only a breath before lifting the pen. The letters were shaky, but they were hers, written in her own hand after years of being silenced. When she set the pen down, something inside her settled. No man could ever again claim her without defying the law itself. Afterward, they stopped at the store. Ethan bought flour and beans, then paused at the counter. "Got rings?" he asked. The shopkeeper raised a brow, then opened a small box of plain bands. Ethan chose one simple and steady, paid with coins he might have used for tools, and slipped it into his pocket without ceremony. That evening, back at the cabin, he set the ring on the table between them. His words were as plain as always, but his eyes carried weight. "Stay with me for good, as my wife if you want it." Sa stared at the ring, her breath shallow. Images rushed through her, the jeers of the yard, the rope burning her wrists, the laughter that had marked her as nothing. But then she looked at Ethan, the man who had never once spoken of the trade, who had placed her name beside his on paper, who had stood between her and every shadow that tried to claim her again. Her voice was steady when she answered, "Yes, but as your equal." His lips curved in the faintest smile, rare but true. "As my equal." He slid the ring onto her finger, the cool metal warming quickly against her skin. It was not a chain, it was a choice. She reached across the table, resting her hand over his, her heart steady in her chest. The fire crackled, shadows flickering across the walls, and for the first time she felt not only safe, but truly seen. Later that night, as the stove glowed low and the desert air cooled outside, they lay together in the narrow bed, the ring still shining faintly on her finger. Ethan's arm rested across her, his breathing slow and even. Sa pressed closer, her cheek against his chest, and whispered a song from her people, soft and healing. It was a song of endurance, of love rising from loss. He listened in silence, his scarred hand stroking her hair with a tenderness he rarely allowed himself. In that quiet, they found not just rest, but the certainty of a life they were building together, one born not of rescue or debt, but of trust, equality, and love chosen freely. And as the night deepened, with only the sound of wind in the sage and the steady rhythm of their breaths, they both knew the desert had given them something rare, a new beginning, a family forged not by blood, but by choice. The world beyond might still whisper, might still doubt, but within the walls of the cabin their truth was undeniable. They were no longer two broken lives crossing by chance. They were partners, equals, bound not by the past, but by the future they had chosen to walk together. Summer ripened across the desert, carrying with it the scent of sage and the low hum of cicadas. The cabin no longer stood as a place of solitude. It breathed with life. Sa rose each morning with the sun, her hair tied back as she stepped into the garden she had planted behind the corral. Rows of beans, squash, and corn stretched from soil she had coaxed into giving again, her fingers tenderly weeding, her hands darkened by earth, yet lightened by purpose. Ethan watched her sometimes from the porch, his scar catching the first rays of dawn, and he knew that the life he had once held together with silence and scars had shifted into something whole. She was no longer a shadow in his home. She was the light that filled it. The whispers in town softened over time, fading from sharp judgments to uncertain glances. When Sa walked beside Ethan down the boardwalk, her head no longer bent but lifted steady, people began to see not a woman sold for 2 coins, but a wife who had chosen her place. The deputy who had once questioned her came to their wedding, standing at the back of the small church with quiet approval in his eyes. The preacher's voice was plain, the vows simple, yet when Ethan said, "I do," and Sa echoed it, their words carried more weight than all the whispers combined. A ring slid once more onto her finger, this time before witnesses, sealing not ownership but equality, not chains but love. Afterward, they shared pie at the cafe, sitting side by side as townsfolk pretended not to stare. Some still judged, some still doubted, but a woman nodded at Tsar with a trace of respect, and that was enough. They rode home slow, the sun setting behind them, and when they reached the ridge, Tsar looked at the cabin with new eyes. It was no longer his, it was theirs. Life became a song of quiet rhythms. Ethan split wood in the yard, his limp slowing but never stopping him. Tsar sewed clothes from the bolt of cloth, hung laundry that swayed in the breeze, hummed melodies that carried the strength of her people. Together they cleared the garden, mended fences, rode to town for flour and coffee. At night they sat on the porch steps with mugs in hand, the sky spilling with stars. She leaned against his shoulder, his hand resting over hers, and the silence between them no longer carried emptiness but peace. Healing was not quick, but it was real, built in the countless small choices to stay, to trust, to love. Storms came and passed, testing the roof, rattling the shutters, but each time they stood together, stronger than before. When nightmares returned to Tsar, she no longer faced them alone. Ethan's steady presence at her side, his low voice reminding her, "You're safe here," became her anchor. And when his limp ached with the weather, she carried more of the load, her hands steady as she supported him. Their love was not built of grand gestures, but of constancy, of knowing that no matter what the world brought, they would meet it together. Seasons shifted, the desert changing colors under their watch, and so too did they. Tsar was no longer the broken figure who had stumbled into his life in chains. She was strong, resilient, her laughter returning like water after drought. Ethan, once silent and resigned to loneliness, found his voice in her presence, his heart softened by her touch, his solitude replaced by belonging. They had become each other's healing, each other's home. On one quiet evening, with the fire glowing low and the smell of fresh bread lingering in the air, Tsar took his hand across the table, her eyes steady on his. "We are family," she whispered. Ethan nodded, his rough fingers closing gently around hers. "Ours," he answered. And in that single word, the story that had begun in dust and cruelty found its rest in love and peace. Their lives were not marked by wealth, nor by the world's approval, but by the quiet certainty that they had chosen each other. And in the end, that was more than enough. Two scarred souls had found not only survival, but wholeness, not only refuge, but joy. The woman once sold for $2 silver now stood as a wife, a partner, an equal. The cowboy, once haunted by solitude, now stood no longer alone. Together they built a life, a home, and a love that the desert itself seemed to bless with every sunrise. And if this story has touched you, if you felt the healing in their journey, the strength in their choice, the warmth in the way broken lives can find wholeness together, I invite you to share your heart with us. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Let your voice join this circle of healing. And if you wish to keep walking with stories like this one, I warmly welcome you to like, to subscribe, to stay close as we continue weaving tales of love, strength, and hope. Because stories like love grow brighter when they are shared.